Hello, my name is Matt Friedman. I'm going to be talking about the Corona crisis and the impact on modern slavery. To begin with, I just want to point out that when we're talking about this coronavirus crisis, we're actually talking about three pandemics simultaneously happening. The first one is the health crisis itself, the fact that people are getting diseases and it's having an impact on our communities and people are dying and so forth. And that's kind of where much of the attention is focused. The second one is the economic crashes that happen as a result of this. And this happens a little bit later, but with all of these people basically closing their businesses and so forth, you see that this is a vulnerability. And last, there's a third pandemic type element that is associated with the impact of supply chains around the world not functioning, for which a certain number of people will simply just not have food available to them. So I'd like to go through these very quickly because there's a relevance of all of these things on modern slavery. So when it comes to the health crisis, if you watch the news, you know, CNN, for example, 97% of what we see is focused on the coronavirus. We as human beings are concerned about our health and the health of our family members and our community and so forth. So we are focusing on the impact of the virus on all of us. And that will be an obsessive type of focus for a period of time. Gradually over time, though, people will start kind of getting into whatever it is the new normal is, and we'll be moving away from that. But for the most part, that's not going to happen until we start wearing masks. And I know there's all kinds of debates around the world related to whether you wear a mask or don't wear a mask. We have to all wear masks. That's what's going to protect us from the coronavirus. So during this first pandemic element, there's great fear, obsessive focus on health, and a lot of other factors are ignored. Those things come a little bit later. The second part of the crisis is the economic crisis. And we've seen closures, unprecedented closures, actual countries closing down, where restaurants and commerce and businesses and flights no longer function. As a result of this situation, it results in all kinds of impacts on stock markets. We're seeing massive numbers of people who aren't able to work. We're seeing people being furloughed. We're seeing businesses crashing. And this also results in a certain amount of disruption because people get very frustrated, they get very angry, and this gets translated into protests. In the United States, we had the protests that took place related to both closures of businesses and Black Lives Matter. And so you will see disruptions that often take place after this. The World Bank estimates that up to 500 million people will slip into poverty as a result of this. So the gains that we've had over the last 15, 20 years could potentially be lost as a result of this. We're also seeing spikes in mental health. We're seeing issues related to suicide, alcohol abuse, drug abuse, domestic violence, divorce is increasing, partly because when you put people together in a space for an extended period of time without a lot of outlets, it can significantly kind of spiral into something quite negative. So the second part of this pandemic, the economic side, has as the outcome significant poverty increases, debt associated with the fact that people don't have money coming in, businesses are suffering. It will take a long time for this recovery to take place, and people are emotionally exhausted. The third element of this has to do with what happens when entire supply chains are shut down. And if you look online and look at some of the videos that we're seeing shortages of things. You don't have migrant workers in the fields picking the fruits and the vegetables. You basically don't have trucks moving from place to place. Borders are closed. Less ships are moving from place to place, part because the people on the ships don't want to go on the ships. And as a result of this, we have the potential for there to be disruptions of a completely different nature, where food shortages take place. Now, if you look at sub-Saharan Africa, if you look at other parts of the world where they've had locust infestations and they've had shortages of food and various other things, you see that maybe 6 months from there, a year from now, you're going to see a lot of people in dire circumstances. the normal everyday systems to ensure that we have the drugs that we need and the food we need and the supplies we need are just not functioning. And so a certain percentage of people could die from starvation. And in one case, it was estimated that COVID might kill 1 million people, but starvation could kill 25 million people. So in terms of the possible outcomes, food harvesting restrictions, limited transport, food shortages, prices jumping up, and this could lead to unrest, protests, and in the worst case scenario, hunger could come out as a result of this. And so the point I'm trying to make is that when we look at the impact of COVID on kind of the communities that we work with who are vulnerable to slavery, we have to take into consideration that this thing isn't going to go away soon, but we also have to look at this from multiple different ways. It has to be something that we approach from different perspectives. So what I'd like to do now is to just switch over to kind of the impact of this issue on manufacturing. And we use manufacturing because manufacturing is where there are supply chains, where you have people who basically work for factories and sub-factories and so forth. And what we're seeing in this particular situation is that when supply chains don't have something like a disruption related to like what we're seeing with COVID, the world functions pretty well. So you could make something in China that is a component part that is assembled someplace else, and as long as all of these movements of items takes place, then you can have a very quality, cost-effective type system and procedure. But the moment that breaks down, the moment you're unable to get supplies from one place to another, that interrelatedness becomes a real problem. For example, some of the car companies in Korea needed parts from China, an alternator or carburetor, you know, a drivetrain, something like that, that when the quarantine took place was not available. So they were expecting those items to go to the factory in Korea. They didn't come, so the entire supply chain suffered as a result of that. And so these types of disruptions can completely change the way manufacturing takes place. If that Korean factory doesn't have manufacturing taking place, you have a situation where workers are furloughed and in some cases let off. And it's the emphasis on all of these disruptions that could have a significant impact on modern slavery. For example, what we see in countries where you have day laborers who in the past would work, be paid, they are now furloughed, they are now at home, they're not working, they don't have any money coming in. And so what we're seeing is huge numbers of people who are disenfranchised, huge number of people that are becoming quite desperate because for the first week or two, they kind of tap into their savings, assuming they have something. If they don't, then they're stuck. They have to go out and figure things out. And so what we're seeing is that factory workers who in the past would negotiate for the best kind of deals and arrangements in severance and pay are now saying, I'll work for nothing as long as you feed me and give me a place to stay. So the possibility of having huge numbers of people in this type of circumstance exists now. And that's a huge vulnerability for modern slavery because this desperation will result in people who are unscrupulous taking advantage of this. We have to be concerned about that. Now, as we all know, when it comes to the recruitment process, debt is a huge vulnerability. In Southeast Asia, it represents somewhere between 60 and 70% of the modern slavery issue. Let's face it, with COVID, tremendous debt has been incurred by so many people. The factories, the sub-factories, the employees, families. As a result of this debt, the possibility of somebody holding that debt, manipulating it, and insisting that a person do something on their behalf is a real potential outcome. And so what we have to do in the coming months is really watch this to make sure that we have a handle on if a factory takes over the debt, then the possibility that factory holding a person in place, manipulating their work situation is there, and that creates a real problem. So I think there's going to be a lot of discussions about what we do collectively across Asia to address this element. When we talk to the factories and the sub-factories across Asia, there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty, partly because in some cases, orders have been canceled. Even orders that have been completed have been canceled because the fine print on the bottom says something about how if this can't be delivered within a period of time, then we don't have to pay for it. So as a result of this, you have products that have been developed that will never sell. They basically used resources within the factory. The factory can't pay the employees because they're not being paid. And as a result of this, you have a lot of factory managers that are sitting around with tremendous uncertainty. And so one of the things that we often suggest to the brands that we work with is at least reach out to your contractors and subcontractors, your factories, your sub-factories, to let them know where you are, what's going on, to at least give them some information, because that uncertainty leads to all kinds of people talking and debating and discussing and not knowing what's going on, and that just adds to the confusion. We're finding in some cases that factories are saying, we feel like our workforce has not been contaminated by COVID, and so we're going to make sure that they stay in the factory. They can't leave. Anyone who wants to leave isn't going to be brought back again. Now, under ordinary circumstances, that would be a major red flag for modern slavery if a person didn't have freedom of movement. But in this particular case, companies are arguing they're just doing this as a means of ensuring that their entire factory workforce doesn't get infected. And so under these particular circumstances, maybe for a duration of time, it's acceptable, as long as it's informed. And if a person wants to leave understanding that they can't come back, that's okay. So that has to kind of be built into it. We're finding situations where as factories get back into play, maybe they don't have the same number of workers they had because their workforce came from some other location and these people can't move. And so what we're seeing in some cases is a scenario where a person is told that they have to work overtime. Sometimes they get paid, oftentimes they don't. And what they say is, well, if you want to keep this job, you're just going to have to do what we say. We don't have any money coming in, and so we can't pay you, so you make that choice yourself. This type of situation, if it extends beyond the crisis period, could result in it becoming systemic, and it could result in all kinds of other things. And so all of the factors that I mentioned are red flags, things that we have to watch, things that we have to better understand. And to a certain extent, what we've found is that we've lost ground to a certain extent. The gains that we made in workers' rights and reducing modern slavery and addressing the vulnerability and using third-party audits to determine whether or not people were being exploited, all of those types of things, we can expect that there's going to be a loss as a result of COVID. The extent to which that is chronic remains to be seen, but we'll have to watch this very carefully. So the organization I work with, the Mekong Club, works with private companies to help them to understand the issue of modern slavery and what they need to do in order to address it. And so we get in front of banks, we get in front of manufacturers, we get in front of retailers, hotels. We train them, we give them the tools, the means, and the understanding of what they have to do in order to address this. But we do it in a positive, confidential, supportive way. We never name and shame. We work with them and not against them. So the advice that we're giving them is the first thing they need to do is to have some type of an interim plan. They may have a long-term plan that addresses their modern slavery activities, but what they need is an emergency interim plan, and we're working with them on that. This plan could be in the form of a strategy or a policy, and in some cases, what we're seeing is companies will have an interim 2-year COVID policy statement related to modern slavery that outlines what they are willing to do and not do. For example, in some cases, they might support some of the factories that they work with a limited amount of money to keep the workforce there. In some cases, it would focus on health and safety. Some cases, it would reassure the fact that modern slavery indicators are addressed as part of the process. We encourage them to reach out to their suppliers to give them the feedback they need in order to understand what needs to be done to address modern slavery. We're working with them. We developed the Apprise app that allows us to allow them to have their workers download an app that is specifically related to COVID, that will allow them in their local language to ask questions because they can't get auditors in to see what's happening on the ground. So this is one way of addressing that. We encourage the brands, the companies that we work with, to come together as a community to talk about this, to share the information they have, and to do this in such a way that everyone is kind of moving together at one. You know, when you have concerns about whether you're doing things right or wrong, but you bring a bunch of factories together, brands together, and they share their experiences, everyone gets a general sense of where everybody else is. And that peer pressure also encourages them to move forward to address the issue. We're helping them to identify what red flags of modern slavery might be now and what changes might exist, for example, with things like freedom of movement. As I indicated, maybe they're not allowing people to move initially, but maybe over time when the COVID situation becomes less concerning, that will change, but you have to identify kind of a strategy and an understanding of what that timing might be, under what circumstances, what are the milestones, et cetera. And lastly, health and safety is a relevant part of what we're talking about here. One of the things that we've heard when we come in contact with some of our partners who work on the ground with worker rights, worker-led legislation, responsible recruitment, and so forth, is that they have suggestions that they would like to give to businesses, but there's no bridge between what they are suggesting in the business world. As it turns out, the organization that I work with has contact with the businesses. We're in front of the banks, the manufacturers, the retailers. And as a result of that, we can sit down and say that these are recommendations that are coming from the field. So one of the things that we're doing is we're trying to collect recommendations and suggestions from the community-based organizations that answer the question, if you could get in front of companies and have companies change to be more responsible when it comes to the topics that you're dealing with, what would you want them to do? And so the Mekong Club is acting as a bridge between the private sector and organizations that have these requests. So the bottom line is this: COVID is having an impact on modern slavery. It's significant. We will see changes to just about everything. At the same time, the NGO communities are suffering. The funding that's been available is drying up in some cases. It's being used for other types of activities. It's going to be a challenging time for us. It's important for organizations to pivot at this time, to identify how they can integrate a COVID response mechanism in what they're doing. We need to join up the private sector related organizations with the NGO related ones, and we need to keep on top of this because it's not going to go away. It has the potential to get really bad, but collectively as a community working together, we can make a difference. And so the Mekong Club is always willing and able to work with other organizations. If you're interested in learning more about us, go online, look at our website, or contact us directly. With that, thank you very much, and all the best.